Standing outside the Gravediggers pub in Prospect Square on the north side of Dublin City, you will see before you the original entrance to Glasnevin Cemetery. Known to many Dubliners as the City of the Dead, it is the final resting place for 1.5 million people, outnumbering the living population of Dublin City. This enormous Victorian cemetery, built on a former woodland, is home to the remains of many important figures from Ireland's fight for independence, but also to thousands of poor souls who perished during the Great Famine of the 1840s and a later cholera epidemic. Today, however, we are going to search for one grave in particular, that of renowned Irish poet and writer Brendan Behan. Join us as we walk through this historic cemetery to learn more about its fascinating past and to find the final resting place of Brendan Behan. Glasnevin Cemetery represents the huge changes that were taking place in Ireland in the 1830s. In the 16 and 1700s, a series of penal laws had been imposed against the overwhelmingly Catholic population of Ireland, with the aim of severely restricting their rights. The effects of these laws were still being felt in the 1830s. At the time, Catholics were not permitted to have cemeteries of their own, and instead had to bury their dead in the grounds of old churchyards, monasteries, or in Protestant churchyards. In the eyes of the law, only Protestant clergy were allowed to recite prayers by the graveside. An incident in 1823, when a Catholic priest attempted to lead some prayers at a funeral for one Arthur Darcy and was stopped from doing so, would start a debate that would lead to the creation of Glasnevin Cemetery. The cause of Catholic emancipation was led by Daniel O'Connell, who pushed for the creation of a cemetery where Catholics and Protestants could be laid to rest together with dignity and without the fear of persecution. Glasnevin Cemetery opened in 1832, and when you enter from the Finglas roadside, the first thing you will see is the round tower memorial marking the grave of Daniel O'Connell. The first burial to take place in Glasnevin was that of an 11-year-old boy named Michael Carey, who lived on Francis Street in Dublin. On reading many of the headstones from the 1800s, you will notice that they frequently state the address of the deceased. They are often streets that are now lined with shops, but in Victorian times they were bustling communities and grand residential areas. The cemetery is surrounded by high walls and watchtowers, as in the 1800s a particularly gruesome trade was booming in Dublin. Grave robbing was a common occurrence, and was a very real fear for the families of the recently deceased. In the dead of night, grave robbing gangs would sneak into cemeteries and dig up the recently buried with the aim of selling the corpses for dissection to Dublin medical schools. These grave robbers became known as resurrectionists or sack-em-ups. To combat this, wardens would protect the graves from their watchtowers while a pack of bloodhounds patrolled the grounds of the cemetery. Glasnevin Cemetery is notable for the abundance of trees that line its avenues. Before it was built, the area was largely wooded, and many of the original trees were incorporated in the burial site. The cemetery now occupies 124 acres, and as we look for the grave of Brendan Behan, let's talk a little about his life and why he is so fondly remembered by people all over the world. Brendan Francis Behan was born on the 9th of February 1923 in Holles Street Hospital to Frank Behan, a house painter and a Republican who was imprisoned for 2 years in Kilmainham Jail and Kathleen Behan, née Carney, who was the sister of Peadar Carney, author of Arrow na Bhíon, which would become the Irish national anthem. Born into a staunchly Republican family, Behan grew up on Dublin's north side on Russell Street. He was a member of the IRA's youth organisation Fianna Éireann, and in 1939, at the age of 16, he joined the IRA. Without authorisation from his superiors, in November 1939, he travelled to Liverpool. He was found to be in possession of explosive devices and was quickly arrested. His intent was to drop a bomb down the smokestack of a British man-o'-war. Behan was held for some months in Walton Jail, but because of his age was sentenced to 3 years in Borstal detention, most of which he spent in Holsey Bay and most of which he enjoyed. During this time he took it upon himself to study and become a fluent speaker of the Irish language. In November 1941, Behan was deported back to Ireland, but within 6 months was caught firing shots at a policeman in Dublin. Fortunate not to be condemned to death, he was sentenced to 14 years penal servitude, of which he served less than 5, in Mountjoy Jail, Arbor Hill Military Detention Barracks, and the Curragh Camp, before being released in a general amnesty in 1946. Behan moved between homes in Dublin, Kerry and Connemara, and also resided in Paris for a time. He would find himself in and out of jail for the remainder of his life, mostly for drunk and disorderly conduct. After his release, he tried with limited success to put his illegal activities behind him and establish himself as a writer. Behan's prison experiences were central to his writing career. In Mountjoy he wrote his first play, The Landlady, and also began to write short stories and other prose. He tried to settle in Paris because he was convinced that the odds were against a working class man in Dublin trying to make it as an author. He published 3 high quality short stories, A Woman of No Standing in 1950, After the Wake again in 1950, and The Confirmation Suit in 1953. Drawing on his extensive knowledge of criminal activity in Dublin and Paris, he wrote an engaging serial for the Irish Times, which was later published as The Scarper in 1964. Brendan was making a living as a journalist on the radio and in newspapers, with colourful expressions of characters from his inner city childhood. For the rest of his writing career, he would rise at 7 in the morning and work until noon when the pubs opened. In the 1950s, Behan developed a reputation as a carouser, and shoulder to shoulder with the other writers of the day, such as Patrick Kavanagh and Anthony Cronin, would use McDade's pub as their base. Behan fell out with the spiky Kavanagh, who reportedly would visibly shudder at the mention of Behan's name, and who referred to him as evil incarnate. In 1954, the year of his marriage to Beatrice Salkeld, daughter of artist Cecil Salkeld, his play The Quarefellow was performed and well received at the tiny Pike Theatre in Dublin. It would later be produced by the Theatre Workshop London and was an outstanding success, predominantly because of the directorship of Joan Littlewood, but also the contemporary campaign for the abolition of capital punishment. Behan generated immense publicity for The Quarefellow as a result of a drunken appearance on the Malcolm Muggeridge TV show. Relatively unaccustomed to public drunkenness in authors, the English took him to their hearts. His Irish language play The Hostage opened in 1958 in the Damer Theatre, Dublin. It portrays the detention in a Dublin house in the late 1950s of a British conscript soldier seized by the IRA as a hostage, pending the scheduled execution in Northern Ireland of an imprisoned IRA volunteer. The hostage falls in love with an Irish convent girl, Teresa, working as a maid in the house. Their innocent world of love is incongruous among their surroundings, since the house also serves as a brothel. In the end, the hostage dies accidentally during a bungled police raid, revealing the human cost of war, a universal suffering. The subsequent English language version, The Hostage, in 1958, reflecting Behan's own translation from the Irish, but also much influenced by Joan Littlewood during a troubled collaboration with Behan, is a bawdy slapstick play that bears only a limited resemblance to the original version. 1958 was the year of Behan's masterpiece, The Borstal Boy. He had been working on some form of it since serving his time in Mountjoy Jail. Behan produced a dramatic portrait of the artist as a prisoner, while also creating some of the best comic scenes in modern literature. This was to be the last completed work of Brendan Behan. Behan found fame difficult and became a long-term heavy drinker, describing himself as a drinker with writing problems, and stating that I only drink on 2 occasions, when I'm thirsty and when I'm not. He developed diabetes in the early 1950s, but this was not diagnosed until 1956. As his fame grew, so too did his alcohol addiction. This combination resulted in a series of famously drunken public appearances on both stage and television. Behan's favourite drink was champagne and sherry. His health suffered, with diabetic comas and seizures occurring regularly. The public who once extended their arms now closed ranks against him, and publicans flung him from their premises. His books, Brendan Behan's Island, Behan's New York, and Confessions of an Irish Rebel, published in 1962 and 1964, were dictated onto a tape recorder because he was no longer able to write or type for long enough to be able to finish them. On the 20th of March 1964, Behan died after collapsing at the Harbour Lights Bar, now Harkin's Bar and Bistro, in the shadow of the Guinness Brewery. He was transferred to the Meath Hospital in central Dublin, where he died aged 41. At his funeral, he was given a full IRA Guard of Honour, which escorted his coffin. It was described by several newspapers as the biggest Irish funeral of all time, after those of Michael Collins and Charles Stewart Parnell. Acclaimed Irish sculptor James Power sculpted Brendan Behan's death mask. Since his death, Behan is frequently mentioned in works of popular culture. He is the subject of Streams of Whiskey, a song by the Pogues. Thousands Are Sailing, written by guitarist Philip Chevron, features the lyric, and in Brendan Behan's footsteps, I danced up and down the street. Behan is also referenced in Damien Dempsey's Jar song. Behan's version of the third verse of the Internationale from Borstal Boy was reproduced on the LP sleeve of Dexy's Midnight Runners' debut album, Searching for the Young Soul Rebels. In the Republican plot of the cemetery, you can find the headstone of Brendan Behan's uncle, Pater Carney. Carney too was a Republican, and a composer who wrote many rebel songs. Most notably, he wrote the lyrics to Aaron Nevian, a soldier's song in English, which was adopted as the Irish national anthem. Carney was born on Lower Dorset Street in 1883, and passed away on the 24th of November 1942 at Inchicore.